So, as I said, we're very happy to have Rosander here. And so you have worked on chemicals issues for, I don't know, 20, 25 years or something like that, or even more?
Yeah. Too long.
You worked at Greenpeace, you were leading ChemSec for many years, and also this, what's the European, not this, there was this also this international network you were working on.
IPEN.
IPEN,
Yes.
Yes.
International POPs Elimination Network.
Yeah.
And Healthcare Without Harm. I've been in them all
Well,
for a while, yeah.
And now, since some years, you're working as a consultant, right?
Yeah.
And you are working then with this with our chemicals agency in a couple of projects that you will tell about.
Yeah.
Perfect. So we will go on now at maximum until 10. Maybe you will present for half an hour or something, and then we can have a discussion. There is also coffee and some buns afterwards, and we will also continue after that in maybe smaller groups. I mean, you're most welcome to stay on and discuss some more formal project-related issues.
Okay, thank you. Great to be here. Very competent group of people. Makes me a bit nervous. No, but it's great. And since I now know what you know, what your level of competence is, I will rush through some of the pictures, I think. But it's to me, it's also like we're such a small group, so let's discuss rather than I'm speaking here for a long time. But yes, a very long title. Daniel asked me to write a title, and it was on the train, it was very late, and that's when you tend to have very, very long sentences. So I won't even try to explain what I meant with that. But I could say that I am a chemist by training, but like Daniel was saying, I quickly turned into, or it just happened that way, that I was hired by Greenpeace. And then, since then I've been more or less full-time working on chemical politics, policy making in Europe, also a bit in US, internationally with the Stockholm Convention, and in Sweden. So it just turned out to be that way, that I haven't been in a lab basically since I left school, university. So what I will, and I should also mention that I work for a company called Trossa. So it's a group of people, mostly chemists with chemistry background, that do different stuff. One thing that's, I think is a bit relevant here, is that we are involved in several research projects. One is the Mr. Pharma, which is now a project that has been reported and has ended, but Trossa was communicating between the different groups and between the different academic groups, and also with the companies and other stakeholders. We do run the communication in this program called Swedish Infrastructure for Ecosystem Science, which is basically a system to facilitate the sharing of information, data sets from different locations, where terrestrial, all kinds of different systems that are produced at different locations in Sweden. And we're just about to start up working with Kristina Rudén at the Stockholm University on a project looking at the circular economy and how chemicals can be managed in a circular economy. So it's touched very much upon what I will be talking about today as well. I will talk about these two things that I'm doing right now. One is, both of them is supposed to be done by end of March. We'll see about that. But the first one is something that's been going on for a while. It's for the Chemical Inspectorate, looking at green chemistry, how the chemicals issue is going to be integrated, or how it can be integrated in what we call the circular economy. I'll talk more about that. The other part, or I will end up talking about the work that's now going on to set up a Substition Centre for substituting hazardous chemicals and products in Sweden. It's financed by the government. It actually has already received its first 3 years of funding. It's not much money, but it's a way of it's like starting up a center. So right now I'm involved in producing that proposal. What should be the content? How should it be structured? How should it communicate? What methodologies should that center be applying and things like that? So a lot of very interesting and quite challenging issues actually. And it's a very short timeline as well, because we have to report by the end of March. So let's talk about that as well. These two I will jump really. I was going to talk a bit about green chemistry. I don't know, green chemistry to you all, that's pretty, you know all about it. So I'll leave it. Or raise your hand.
We don't.
You don't? Okay.
I heard about the 12 principles, so to say.
This is actually, well, it's called green synthesis, and this was the best picture I found, but it's basically 12 principles for how you can design molecules to be more sustainable. It was invented by people in US, at the US EPA actually, in the 90s I think, and it has been a kind of a broad set of principles for how you should think, like using renewable feedstocks, like having an energy efficient process for making your chemicals, but also how to avoid waste in the short run in your process, of course, but also waste in a more general sense.
Is this so general that there is a consensus, or has that been developed? Or I mean, if it was in the late 90s that these researchers proposed this, I mean,
there's a lot of work.
It was tested or not?
There's green chemistry centers around. There's an academic discipline for sure. That's been evolving in US, in UK. There's green centers in a lot of regions around the world. It's quite academic, I would say. I wouldn't say it has been. One of the problems with the whole concept is that it hasn't really made it to industry. So it's seen as more of an academic subject. But I think it has a very interesting approach, where it tries to integrate not only the toxicity of the substance, but also things like how to integrate it in a more systematic, the circular economy, for example. Some people would say that it's too narrow, in that it's looked mostly on the actual design of the substance. So after leaving the production phase, that it's not really so relevant. I would say that I think it can be applied quite widely as principles. But we can talk later about that. The other issue, circular economy, I think needs no explanation for this group, right? Just to move back a bit, one thing that I was asked by the Chemical Inspectorate, I think in 2010, was to look at how chemicals, work on chemicals, integrates with other issues. Because we have these, sorry this is in Swedish, but these are the 12 environmental goals that Sweden set up in 2008. And so the question that KEMI raised was how do we make sure that chemicals is not marginalized, the work on chemicals, when it comes to huge issues, very important issues like climate mitigation, like also now circular economy as one of the the themes of what the EU is doing on environment. So how do we make sure that toxicity is not forgotten or treated in a discriminated way in these areas? So that was the question really. More recently, KEMI did a kind of study on the new UN Agenda 2030 goals, and they concluded that about 8 of those 17 main goals had close connection to chemicals. So you need to, of course, integrate chemical issues into the whole picture of sustainability. The question is it done, and how can we make sure, if it's not done properly, how can we make sure that it is? So we set up these 3 challenges. There are more, but of course, looking at what happens in society, there's a strong strive for new technologies, infrastructure. And am I standing the wrong way?
Yeah, kind of. You should be standing over there probably.
Okay,
But,
I just have the computer.
Yeah, I can put the camera over there instead, I think. Stupid setup.
Should I wait?
No.
It's a climate, but also circular economy as a challenge. And if you make a very rough summary of this, we need some sort of chemical production that is not only based on less toxic or even toxic free. It should also, in the long run, be fossil free. It shouldn't be based on fossil material, and it should, in line with circular economy, also be waste free. So that's a challenge to take on. So we did this first report for KEMI, which talked about the connection, the links between chemicals and climates, trying to see if there were any synergies in the work that's done in the 2 areas, and also possible conflicts. First observation, of course, is that chemicals do have an effect on the climate on its own. The chemical industry, the International Council of Chemical Association made an estimation a few years ago that about 8% of all global CO2 emissions inherited from some sort of chemical production or use or waste disposal of chemicals. So that's, if you compare it to the quite broad discussion about airplanes releasing emissions of CO2, that's quite considerable. So fossil free, and looking at why this is. Sorry, this is a bit Swedish again, but I'll try to explain it. This is also from the chemical industry's own report. They saw a total emission of 3.3 gigaton CO2 equivalents, and looking at where that come from. Some came from the extraction of raw materials. A lot of it comes from production, where you have a lot of emissions because energy use and so forth. But also the breakdown after the chemicals has been used, where the breakdown leads to CO2 emissions. And then you have greenhouse gases that are not CO2, but because there are a lot of persistent chemicals that do have a warming potential, that becomes also a factor in this. So that's the estimate from industry, making up then about 8% of all CO2 emissions or equivalents. So the question then, one of the questions that of course is interesting is, if we go from what should we do about this? Well, one thing that's obvious to industry, and also kind of pushed by industry, is that we need to find a bio-based raw material to replace the oil that's now used for products. And probably know about this project, which was a project run by this industries in Stenungsund, a petrochemical complex here, called Hållbar Sustainable Chemistry 2030. I've been kind of evaluating this for the city of Gothenburg, and it's obvious that while I would talk about sustainable chemistry as a mix of bio-based, transfer to bio-based, but also toxicity, decreasing toxicity and so forth, this project was pretty much only about how do we replace the bioethane in our, the ethane in our processes today with the bio-based ethane. So not really switching any products or transferring to other more suitable for circular economy or so forth, but more changing the sourcing of the whole of the plants, which is of course understandable in a way because the plants are there, they're established, a lot of investment. So if you could push just transfer the raw material to something that's more bio-based, then you can maintain a lot of the equipment and the value change that you already created.
Could I just ask?
Absolutely.
When you're talking about chemical industry and the emissions there, does that include fossil fuel production and use, or how does that factor in there?
No. This would be products like chemical products, plastics, polymers.
Yeah.
Now, if you would include the fuels, of course, you would have the whole.
Yeah, that's why I was wondering.
The fuels for transport and everything.
Yeah. So fuel extraction, and because production, for example, also uses a lot of energy when you distill and fractionate things.
Well, the production, I think the main emission source here would be the actual the use of fuel to fuel the processes.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, but not the fuels in themselves that goes to other sectors.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Hello. So, trying to do this quickly, but we did define some synergies. Then, if you try to reduce the toxic emissions, reduce the amount of toxic chemicals, and also look at what we do on the climate side. Are there synergies? Of course there are, and some of them we could argue around them, but I think most of them are pretty self-explaining. But if you reduce the amount of fossil materials, for example, you do decrease also the amount of, for example, mercury in coal that is released as a consequence of using coal. So that's an obvious synergy. If you recycle more, then you decrease the need for new materials. So if you could recycle much more than you do today, you would, in theory at least, decrease the amount of chemical input, unless you use a lot of chemicals for actually running these processes. There's this thing about especially halogenated substances. Some of them are extremely effective greenhouse gases, and they're also toxic. So that's just an obvious synergy. If you like, for example, with the Montreal Protocol, eliminate some of these halogenated substances, you're also going to eliminate the toxic effects that they have. And you could go on. I won't really. We can talk about this later, or if you have a comment. Otherwise, let's also mention some of the potential conflicts that we described for KEMI. One to look at, of course, if we do mean to supply fuels, we need biofuels, for example, with very effective methods, and we know that there is a competition with food production and so forth. There is, of course, a problem that we might have increased use of chemicals as a consequence of that. There's some toxic additives that we looked at that might increase as we start using more biofuels. That also, of course, depends if it's going to be worse or less worse, because there's a lot of additives in the fuels that are made out of fossil fuels. One example that tends to feel more historical now is the mercury in energy bulbs, where you have new alternatives that does not contain mercury, but at this time it was a more obvious case of conflicting goals. You can look at the solar cell production, the batteries always strive for better efficiency. That in order to achieve that, of course, there is you have to mix and use certain chemicals that could be very toxic. We also talk about the rare earth metals that are important to achieve these kind of efficiencies, and also sizing down the whole thing it increases the demand for more effective chemicals per unit, and that tends to often create a more toxic use of toxic substance. And a couple of others. Nanomaterial, same thing there, that we don't really know the toxic, the health, environmental consequences of putting these new materials in. So we looked at those things. We looked at, of course, the upside of using chemicals in climate. And going back to this study by the chemical industry, they realized that they said we are 8% of the problem, but in fact, by using our product, we could solve much more than that. So the plus and minus in that made them come out pretty good anyway, which wasn't really a surprise. But so this is where they calculated the gains from using chemicals more cleverly in insulation, in lighting, in agriculture, in better chemicals for anti-fouling, marine anti-fouling, things like that, and other things. So, and of course, this is very much part of the whole issue here, that we need to use chemicals in these systems to actually increase the efficiency, and in these big infrastructure transformations of the society, chemicals has a very crucial role. Question then becomes, are we also looking at the toxicity of these chemicals, and is there a thorough analysis of whether these new chemicals that are applied are good or bad from a toxic perspective? This one I stole from Anders Wikman for some reason. But this was all about chemicals versus climate. Then we have the whole issue of chemical or circular economy. And this was just to put down some of the aspects we are talking about now. The EU has this new circular economy package that they're working on. And the reason I included this was that I listened to Anders a couple of weeks ago and talked about these things of how the focus of this is maybe not so much on toxic chemicals. Actually, there's very few words in the package about toxicity and how to prevent toxic chemicals to be a problem. There's a lot of focus on waste directives, and then he noted some things that, like promotion of reuse, is not really very quick progress on. There's not done so much for promoting secondary materials and so on. But just this was more to mention that yes, this is a very hot political issue, and this is a picture that I think the EU, the Commission has produced themselves as well, just to explain how chemicals could actually be integrated in this thing. You know, as you know, there is a strategy in development for a non-toxic environment on EU level. It's supposed to be presented 2018. So there is a parallel process where people are actually working on how can we make sure that chemicals are not becoming a bigger problem because of circular economy. And this whole thing concentrates on a few things. They talk about exit strategies as an important tool, that if we're going to have a clean or sustainable loops of material, then we have to have a system for removing things that we definitely don't want it to be in the system. And that needs to be really looked at. How can we make sure that things like DHP, for example, as a good example, is not entering into the system again? And there needs to be, of course, building confidence in secondary raw materials. There needs to be more clarity on waste criteria. We need to have much more information on the products that are introduced into the system and so on. There's no new things here really, just to point out that there's a number of challenges when it comes to how can we make sure that the loops are toxic, non-toxic, and not become toxic to us. I thought I'd talk about this quickly on one particular thing, which is plastics and plastic packaging. This is an article that came out a couple of weeks ago in DN, and it's talking about a scandal that's been taking place over the last 4 or 5 years, where the plastics that are collected by the household, sent away for being new material, has not really been used for new material. It's been going to cement production, a lot of it. It's a company that's taking care of this, and they've been doing this for a very long time. So it's a scandal. It's the whole credibility of the system is at stake, I would say. People wash their bottles and they go with them to this collection place, and then they find out in the paper that it's been burned as a cheap fuel for cement production. But I would say this is something that we could almost expect would happen. And the reason for that, I think, is that we are still not really caring about what products, what materials we are putting into this cycle. I work with the packaging for KRAV, which is one of the certifiers of organic food in Sweden. And we do have a project on packaging, because we say packaging should not be produced with PVC and should be recyclable and all that. And for me, it's been a kind of surprise that this system actually works with companies producing packaging without thinking anything about whether it's going to be recycled or not. They talk about recyclability as a fact, but it's not really recycled. And this is, in the way I see it, a very big problem, that you have people like these nice guys. There's a company down in Skåne, what they do is that they sell a packaging material that's 50% fossil fuel and 50% minerals. And they say this is a very good thing, because you cut half of the fossil fuel or the fossil material in the packaging, so it's very good for the environment. The problem is that when this package enters into the stream of waste, it's not recyclable. It destroys the recycling. The minerals makes the whole system work less good. So you should avoid any kind of minerals if you want to recycle plastic packaging in Sweden. Now these guys, when I talked to them the first time, they weren't even aware of that, and that's because they haven't been talking to the waste sector. What happens to our package when it comes to you? And there seems to be no communication in between those two parts of society, which is amazing to me. The other issue that we've been looking at is these with biodegradable plastics, which has the same kind of problem, that when it comes into the plastic recycling, it's going to be rejected, and it also takes away other plastics that in theory would be good to recycle, but it's not recycled because the degradability makes the whole recycle technology not working. So this is, to me, an issue that needs to be addressed, that there's still, when it comes to plastics and plastic packaging, there's still no information, no clear policy directing the producers of packaging what they should use in order to make it work in a systematic, in a circular economy. Quite the opposite. They look about design, they look about health, food contact material, legislation and so forth, but recycling is not on their radar. And you have other things happening, like this other example is Durapulp by Rosander, forest company that's introduced something that's trying to make a market on the traditional plastic market. So introducing a value chain where this material is based on cellulose and a combination with a polymer. So that kind of messes up the whole thing about is this a plastic packaging or is it a paper or a cardboard packaging? And all these issues are just floating around, I think. There's no one really taking care of them. The politicians are talking about increasing the level of the ambition of recycling. Should be 80%, should be 90%. But no one really looks at what's going into the system. And that's a crucial thing that we start making rules around that, I think. Time flies when you're having fun. I will just mention that what we are doing right now in this KEMI assignment is looking at what kind of policy instruments could we use to make chemicals management a more integrated part of what's going on in other fields of environmental policy making. And this is just a list of possibilities, really. But one thing that we are coming close to suggesting to KEMI to work on is these 10 kind of steps towards toxic-free circularity. I'm not sure that's going to be the final name or title, but we are suggesting to them that use green chemistry as a theme and talk about it as a necessity for a circular economy. If we keep pouring in toxic materials from different sources into the system, we're never going to have a sustainable circular economy. And green chemistry is a way, then a mean for achieving a circular economy. Then research and development. KEMI is quite frustrated in a way that they don't get really into these huge research projects. There's this bioinnovation is a huge project with 100 million a year project to develop new materials, new value chains based on biomaterials. They've been trying to kind of contact them and see, we know things about this too. We think that toxicity is a very crucial thing looking at when you judge what is good for the future. But the interest from bioinnovation, as they say to me, has not been great. So that's the kind of thing that KEMI is struggling with, that you need to come into these tables and sit down and say, hey, we have to have a look into the aspect of toxicity as well when we make these huge decisions about who's going to get the money to research new future materials. We are talking a bit about how to put more taxes on SVHC. As you know, there will be a new tax on electronics and some plastics, some PVC building materials from 1st of July. And we'll see. Industry hates it, but it's going to happen. And the question is whether it can be moved further. After this first wave of criticism, I think there is a new discussion that will take place.
Any specific proposals regarding the substances of great concern?
Well, I mean, this is very still vague. So this is kind of a list of things that KEMI could continue to push for, to explore more. So it's no checklist for what to do at the moment.
But you have a rough idea of how that will be done?
No, I can't say that. No. I never thought this tax would actually be a reality, the one that's happening now. So that's a surprise to me that it actually happens. So I'm really not an expert on saying that will work. But as if that's one step into a more broad approach to how to avoid toxic materials going into the circular economy, that could be one of the steps. financial instruments. Promoting materials with the best potential. Now, talking about plastics again, PVC is obviously not a good material to put into a recycling scheme, if you ask me, because it contains chlorine, has a lot of additives, it needs a lot of additives that are often toxic to actually work. So to distinguish materials that have the properties that could work well in a future society is something good. Now we talk about plastics, like any plastic could be recycled, which is of course true in a technical way, but not in an environmental and sustainable way. I already talked about the exit strategies, but that's important to define routes for material to be removed from the system in order to not contaminate it. The plastic economy as a case study is, to me, a quite interesting prospect. Plastics is, there's work going on in different countries. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation is having a big project called the Plastic Economy, and we're just thinking about how Sweden and KEMI could kind of promote that kind of thinking. Producer responsibility, our old friend, which we've been talking about extended producer responsibility for so long, but when we look at it today, and I look at it from this aspect of packaging recycling, I see it, this is tax, this is a fee going to producers, and they comply with it, they pay it and they collect it, but that's where it ends. It doesn't drive development towards less toxic materials. So it has great potential, but politically it's been shrinked into something more like a system for producers to pay to get rid of the problem. And it's even worse than that, because I think today when politicians ask for more to be done by the producers, they say, well, we have the producer responsibility, so don't attack us. We do pay for this, we are taking care of the problem, leave us. So it's kind of sometimes working against the whole idea of taking more producer responsibility. There might be very good examples of where it works, but I think there's also cases where it doesn't work at all. Recycled materials, a lot about how to make circular economy work. Just to make sure that there is an interest in these recycled materials, that they do comply with the quality standards so that you can actually use them, but they also comply with the level of being non-toxic. So, and of course, one of the critical discussions there has been the whole thing about the Commission or the EU allowing DHP to be recycled, which is to me one of the dividing point there. If you allow substances that we know are cancerogenic and reprotoxic to be introduced again into new recycled products, then you have a problem. But that's a political fight going on. This is more about identifying toxic hotspots in the flows, and this is a long story. I will talk about it very briefly, but we've been looking into the whole idea of when you do the authorization in EU. The way the whole system is set up is really discriminating the alternative. Because there is this, the industry that applies, yes, they have to do this kind of assessment of alternatives, but when it comes to play, it's not really a fair play. The alternatives is discriminated for a lot of reasons. And what we are suggesting to KEMI here, maybe we should suggest it to other authorities, that we have laws on competition in these countries. And if we are serious about that, we should make sure that there is a clear playing field for this, that alternatives should have the same chances to be allowed, to be approved as the material that's already on the market. And I think there's a lot of things that you can work with there, and also to really use the competition laws as a driver in that. Now it's more used as a way of restricting and saying that, well, if you put environmental restrictions on certain things, then you will not have the real competition. But maybe we can turn that around. Now this is going to be the 10 suggestions for KEMI to play around with. I don't know what they're going to do with them, but maybe they will take a couple of them and try to move ahead on them. So that was that report. Now it's I will be very quick about the other report. That's the establishment on this Substitution Centre. So the Substitution Centre has been an idea for a long time in different places in the government. Now it's actually happening, which is great. The government has set aside 5 million a year for the first 3 years to actually establish this. That's a very low sum of money if you're going to be serious about helping companies to substitute. But what we are doing in that investigation is that looking a lot on producers, importers, retailers' need for help in substituting to better chemicals, in particular SMEs. It's going to be voluntary. It's not a new legislation. So what's been going on over the last 6 months is a dialogue with a lot of people in different locations, looking at, and that's what I've been in particular doing, looking at initiatives of the same sort in other countries. How are they established? How effective have they been in their work? And then also in this would be to start suggesting methodologies. What type of services should this center do, or provide the companies with, and also an organizational structure. The model for assessing alternatives is interesting, and this is placed very, very nicely into what the Formas project that you are working on. Because we are looking at methods, methodologies, tools that are used in other countries. We need to adjust them in some way, but the idea is to set up some sort of alternative assessment process that can be provided to companies. Maybe even if companies are using this method in a good way, then there could be some sort of goodwill mentioning of this, that kind of a sign or a label saying that they've been doing the good alternative assessment. This is just to say that the whole problem here is like Finding Dory. I haven't seen the movie, but I understand that this is fish. She has a very short-term memory. So in a way, to me, it's a bit the same thing, that we know so little about the whole complexity of what could happen with a chemical. We can build huge databases, but we still wouldn't know whether this is the right information. So the key issue here is how to make an informed decision, emphasizing informed when so much data is missing. How to make policy, how to make sure that you are enough certain that this substitution is okay or not. So we are doing into a number of steps, which is really also very much methodology. It's used stepwise methodology in doing substitution in other countries. This is also in Sweden, but we can go back to this later. This is the initiatives that I've been looking into. Many of them is in US, some of them in Europe, some in Canada, so forth. A lot of interesting stuff going on. You can get the PowerPoint later if you want. One that's particularly interesting, I think, in a way, is the California one. It's just been released, a draft for how to make an alternative assessment. It's quite complex, and it involves a lot of different parameters. That's not only toxicity, and it works on products rather than individual chemicals. So it's uncertain whether they will actually succeed in this, but it's a very ambitious program. Okay, it's almost 10. I stop there.
Okay, thanks a lot.
So, can I ask why the budget is so constrained? Why is it? Because I think they should be funded by themselves through kind of support from industry, because it can develop into sort of consulting.
You talk about the center?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the whole idea, the government says that it should be self-financed, not by the government in the long run. So it's not an undertaking by the government. It should, the 15 million right now, they see as a seed money for setting up this whole thing. They could change their mind. One thing that we are actually discussing with the government is that from the first, this new chemical tax, it will give 2.4 billion crowns, which is a substantial amount. If you take 1% or 2% of that, you will have 2% will give you 50 million a year. And to me, it's a wonderful logic in it, because industry has been very, very critical to the whole tax, and they say that this is just a tax, it gives us nothing back. So we can say that, well, 2% of it at least is going back to you as a service for helping you to do the substitution. So I think it's a no-brainer, but it's a political issue, and maybe we can. That would be a way to actually size up the whole thing. The other way would be to industry for actually having, like many of these initiatives, they are based on fees from industry, fee for service, basically.
There is also a resistance of kind of earmarking taxes for certain purposes.
Yeah, I know. It's.
But the thing is that since that substitution or the information does really have sort of like public good kind of nature, because it's so difficult to find information about substitutes. We were just trying, and we just had a meeting with ChemSec yesterday.
Oh, yeah.
And they had told us how difficult it is that they just can't describe successful experiences. They are kind of developing some sort of marketplace where producer can share information.
Block it for chemicals, yes.
Exactly.
eBay for that.
Yeah, that's what they say.
It is a huge problem, but so the center could be kind of clearinghouse for a lot of information. That's one possibility. And I think partially it could be that, but that's a big undertaking in itself. And I think the problem especially for smaller companies, is that you don't even know how to ask the question.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like you're sitting with you don't know what substance is really bad and what you should replace in the first place. So you need to have help with that. Then you need to understand that it can be replaced, and then you need to have a number of options, and then you need help to implement it as well.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like very much helping industry in a very practical way.
Mm-hmm.
That's from the talks we've been having with industry, that's obvious. That it's not only providing them with alternative information. It's not going to happen anyway. They need much more hands-on help.
Yeah, but I mean, substitution is something that companies do all the time anyway, and that's one of their main arguments against all these state-driven initiatives, to say that we're doing that anyway, so why are you interfering in that? And I think one major problem there is that if we generate a regulatory system where substituting toxic chemicals is a market advantage because we don't want those, or because the consumers are getting well informed, etc. So as soon as we provide incentives for a company to substitute out hazardous or toxic chemicals, they are not going to share the information. If they have an alternative, they are going to market that themselves, and they try to keep that to themselves as close as possible. They are not going to inform ChemSec about that or anything like that. They are going to put that in their packaging materials in order to have a market advantage there. So I think that's a critical, fundamental problem with all those initiatives that are inherently based on the idea that industry is talking to each other, and they don't. So because they keep things within their company.
Yeah, no, competitors.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
there are so many interesting things that I would like to comment on. I don't know really where to begin. Maybe very global. I really like those 10 recommendations that you have there, but I think they are falling too short. I think because I think one problem, whatever we are doing, we will always be struggling with that we're using thousands of chemicals with very limited information available for a lot of them. So for me, one of the critical things to drive the system towards sustainable chemistry, or from a societal perspective, is very simple and very obvious, and that's what chemical industry is really going to hate us when we say that, and that is simply we have to use less chemicals. Full stop, end of story. The problem is simply that within that context, we need to reflect on the functionalities that we're using the chemicals for. Especially when we're talking about food packaging, which is really an interesting example in that case. One of my favorite examples is the individually packaged strawberry that you can buy in Japan. So one strawberry and a bulk of plastic around that. And we can optimize the plastic and we can recycle the plastics until hell freezes over. But I think we have to also consider what kind of uses are we allowing. And I mean, that's sort of part of, or at least a bit in the authorization scheme of other chemicals, but it's not within reach. You basically can use the chemical to whatever purpose you want it. And I think we have to think about whether that's the right way to go, or how perhaps taxation can also be targeting the use and why are you using those chemicals for. I think that's really critical. And as long as we don't do that, we are still using chemicals for very, very stupid purposes. I mean, we have essential uses, and no doubt about that. But
no, but I'm totally with you on that one.
we should switch that off.